Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to have you all here to welcome Sarah Jensen Carr, assistant professor from Northeastern University, for a very, very timely talk tonight. I think we all know that we're in the process of coming out from a global pandemic, and it's very timely that Sarah is here to speak with us about her work and her research. Um, Sarah is as I said before, an assistant professor at Northeastern University, and her teaching and research focuses on the connections between landscape, human health, urban ecology, and design. The current book in progress, The Topography of Wellness, Health, and the American Urban Landscape, examines landscape responses to 6 historical urban epidemics and the implication for current and future practice. Sarah holds a Master of Architecture from Tulane University and a Master of Landscape Architecture and PhD in Environmental Planning from the University of California, Berkeley, where she was the co-founding editor of the ASLA award-winning Ground Up Journal. She is a licensed architect who has worked professionally in New Orleans and the San Francisco Bay Area. Her research and representational work has been exhibited at San Francisco Planning and Urban Research, SPUR Gallery, the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. In 2017, she held a residential Mellon Fellowship in Urban Landscape Studies at Dumbarton Oaks. Prior to arriving at Northeastern, she held a joint appointment in the School of Architecture and Office of Public Health Studies at University of Hawaii at Manoa, where she worked with several local nonprofits and agencies on evaluation and design initiatives, including Hawaii Department of Health, the Native Hawaiian Health Program at Queens Medical Center, and the Outrigger Duke Kahanamoku Foundation. She is also an advisory board member at Design for Active Sacramento, a cross-sector award-winning team that advocates for and advises on active design initiatives. As I said before, it's very timely that she's with us here today speaking about her work relative to the current pandemic we're just coming out of. Just found out that Sarah actually submitted her transcript for her book February 2020. So the timing of her book couldn't have been better, at least in terms of being its timeliness as something that we should be thinking about relative to the issues that have come up because of COVID. With that, I'd like to welcome Sarah, and Sarah, I'll leave it to you.
Great. Thank you, Alvin, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Dean Curry, for the invitation to speak tonight. And thank you, all of you who are listening in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And yeah, so as Alvin mentioned, I actually did turn in the manuscript for this book in February 2020. This is something I've been working on for a while, actually on and off for about 7 years. The irony of it coming out at this particular point in time is not lost on me, and I should say it actually it did come out officially 2 weeks ago, so so it is available to read. That said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the origins of the book. I am not a historian by training, although this book is, somewhat of a historical tome. As Alvin mentioned, I am an architect. I'm a landscape architect. But for most of my career, I have been fixated on this idea on how buildings and landscapes we inhabit affect our health. So this started early on, immediately post graduation from Tulane University, when I was working on healthcare facilities. And where on a daily basis, we were dealing with the question of how the environment affected patients, as well as doctors, nurses, technical staff, and other providers in a very acute way. Now, I was working on these projects in New Orleans in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit the city. I returned 6 weeks after my initial evacuation, and for some time after, my life was consumed with the recovery, doing FEMA surveys, rehabilitating client buildings, and going to community planning meetings where the focus of the discussion was on how to build back better, more sustainably, and this word healthier. And during that process, I started to think about this main question that threads to my work is in apart, I would say, from healthcare infrastructure. Or in the absence of hospitals, which is what I was experiencing during Hurricane Katrina, or a reliable healthcare system, how does the urban landscape heal and harm us? So, in the book, I describe the formation of the American landscapes through epidemics past and present, starting with cholera and yellow fever in the Industrial Revolution, the relationship between cancer research and the characterization of urban blight in the mid century, to grappling with the physical effects of our largely autocentric environment today. Tonight, I'll primarily be discussing a section in the book I call Progressivism and Purified Air, which focuses on how, after the cholera and yellow fever epidemics were eradicated in the United States, the respiratory illnesses and mental conditions of nervousness born from urban life were addressed through architecture and landscapes, and was perhaps the last movement, pre advent of germ theory, where city shapers tried to address these issues on a broad scale through environmental intervention. And I think you find there's a lot of relevance to our COVID era that we are all living through today. But first, we need to start by talking about the condition of American cities pre sanitary engineering. The first movement connecting the built environment to population health correlates with the beginnings of American urban history during the Industrial Revolution. As factories and workforce populations grew in city centers, so did the amount of waste and sewage dumped in streets. Slaughterhouses were often still inside city limits, there was no municipal sanitation, and air pollution was rampant. Many cities undertook sanitary surveys accounting for detailed descriptions of neighborhoods alongside their mortality rates. One from New York described the literal ground conditions of one sector of the city, accounting for a Frankenstein like ground plane made up of, quote, bricks, mortar, slate, gravel, ashes, coal dust, street sweepings, oyster, clam, lobster, and eggshells, pig's hair, shavings, straw, glass, carpets, brooms, refuse materials from tanneries, crockery, bones, dead animals, as cats, rats, and dogs, shoes, boots, feathers, oyster cans, old tin roofs, tin clippings, etc., etc. Cholera epidemics racked London before it came to American cities, and here we can see a depiction of the epidemic, with death rowing the River Thames, the air and water rendered thickly, associating illness with a polluted environment. Most believe that cholera and yellow fever, diseases that seem to come out of nowhere and kill within a few days, was airborne, a subscription to what we call miasma theory. Miasma theory was the dominant framework for linking health and the environment, which dates back to Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places, written in 400 BC. Hippocrates linked the bad airs that emanated from marshes or polluted water to illness, and these theories had wide acceptance well into the 20th century, most notably in the form of miasma theory, which associated tangibly foul air and water to airborne disease. Miasma theory was prevalent enough that even after physicians like John Snow linked outbreaks in London to polluted water pumps, showing cholera and yellow fever bacterium had to be ingested, there still remained debate even among scientists and physicians. Max von Pettenkofer, a German scientist and hygienicist, subscribed to Snow's theory but still hypothesized that sickness came when the germ itself was allowed to mutate through unfavorable soil, air, and environmental conditions. Speaking to the above schism between medical researchers, Pettenkofer famously and purposely drank a broth with cholera bacterium added to it in order to prove that the disease was not fatal without the predisposing conditions of the environment. Indeed, when he became ill with diarrhea, the stunt did not prove fatal. This cartoon, showing a woman dropping her teacup after realizing what exists in the monster soup of the Thames River water supply, was published as a way to try and explain the origins of this urban illness. But the United States was much slower to accept contagion theory, in part because outbreaks also seemed to come from dense housing units without sufficient ventilation. Many housing units lacked indoor plumbing or sufficient light and fresh air. This cartoon, featured in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper of 1865, was entitled The Tenement Houses of New York, How the Poor Live in Crowded Cities, How Pestilence is Generated, How the Parents are Demoralized and Their Children Depraved, the Great Source of Destitution and Crime. Social scientists who were just beginning to explore the connections between environment and behavior pointed to physical density as a risk factor for moral contagion as well as actual disease spread. And so cholera became ever more correlated with the generalized urban condition, especially regarding dense housing. Here we see cholera as a skeleton telling the landlord of a tenement house that he is about to occupy the premises. And tenements were routinely described as perpetual fever nests by New York's sanitary inspectors. Ultimately, these massive outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever required coordinated action between planners, engineers, public health officials, and doctors. And so, really, the first overhaul of our cities in the name of health came from the massive sanitary infrastructure movement that followed. It was during this time that many of the combined sewage, wastewater, and street runoff systems were installed in cities. And these underground systems also trapped sewage gases underneath the street, addressing both the miasma and contagion fears of the city. Naturally open waterways, which also served as worker encampments as well as waste conveyance, were often contained in underground culverts and paved over. Marshlands were filled in not only to get rid of miasmic gases, but to accommodate industrial expansion, a story we'll return to later in the talk when we discuss Boston. The outfall of these waste systems was still often in an open water body, but at least it was moved out of the city. Many subscribe to the idea that the solution to pollution is dilution, a phrase coined by historian Martin Molosi. Although a significant body of scientists and doctors actually did not believe that the disease was spread through the air, this multi-pronged strategy of personal and municipal sanitation, alleviating density, and remaking or removing industry and worker housing radically remade the haphazard landscape of American cities. Here in this June 22nd, 1895 edition of Harper's Weekly, comparing photos of the same street corners 2 years apart, shows what an incredible transformation street cleaning and paving and waste infrastructure had affected. Streets had to be longer, straighter, and wider to accommodate this infrastructure. At times, even cobblestones thought to hold miasmic filth between them were switched out for smooth pavement that could be washed down at the end of the day. Additionally, many were looking to Europe to see how they had controlled their own cholera epidemics, not only in the massive underground waste infrastructure that they had installed, but in how they were entirely reshaped through urban planning. In his book, Flesh and Stone, Richard Sennett discussed how many 18th and 19th century European cities prioritized circulation and movement via their street networks in the wake of physician William Harvey's discoveries about how the heart powered blood circulation. Dirt and grime in the city were thought to clog healthy airs and prevent its movement. Palaces and places of commerce acted as hearts that powered circulation, and one-way streets were employed to maintain fast movement and mimic the one-way directionality of veins and arteries. We also see this influence in Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago, and Burnham linked health and beauty directly to the potential for capital. In his writing, he dismissed what he called the remorseless enforcement of sanitary programs, but he did conclude that we now regard the promotion of a robust health of body and mind as a necessary public duty, in order that the individual may be benefited and that the community at large may possess a higher average degree of good citizenship. The returns will come in the shape of increase of health and joy of living for all people, and incidentally, the value of every real estate holding in the city will be enhanced. His contemporary Walter Dwight Moody directly referenced Haussmann's plan of Paris, writing that Haussmann's plan is the most beautiful, healthful, convenient, and prosperous city in Christendom. However, those with the attendant resources were starting to depart the industrial city, seeking space and personal personal green spaces in the suburbs. Much of our conception of the suburbs and their relationship to landscape and health was shaped by Ebenezer Howard, a British social reformer who in 1898 wrote Garden Cities of Tomorrow. Howard's professional background was in stenography, but as a young man, he had attempted farming on a homestead in Nebraska. When that enterprise failed, he returned to England and worked as a court reporter. And his work put him in touch with many social reformers, and his book would draw connections between the moral fortitude ostensibly built through agricultural life and the social and health issues of urban life. Howard's Garden City promised the best aspects of both town and country, with low rents, high wages, pure air, pure water, good drainage, bright homes and gardens, no smoke, no slums. And so the Garden City provided the template for many of our early American suburbs, although they did not keep the socialist-leaning labor and economic structures that Howard envisioned. Instead, we see here in a pamphlet for the suburb of Grossdale in Illinois, marketing the virgin soil and new homes on individual plots of land to be sold. But many elite were also starting to leave the city in search of fresh air and waters found in rural nature resorts, a craze also driven by writings from authors such as Thoreau, Emerson, and Hawthorne. Thoreau's account of his time in nature, narrated in Walden, is presented as a moral choice that any man could make to preserve their own health and values. At this time, an affliction that seemed to disproportionately affect urban professionals was Qatar. Loosely defined as a collection of nervous diseases, mostly those affecting the respiratory tract, the disease was closely tied to place, time, and season. Physician Morel Mackenzie's book, Hay Fever and Paroxysmal Sneezing, written in 1887, said that those predisposed to the disease had possession of a peculiar idiosyncrasy, but on what idiosyncrasy depends is quite unknown. Local abnormality affecting the structure of the mucous membrane, the capillaries, or the periphery of the nerves, but of too delicate a nature to admit of detection by available methods of research cannot be determined. However, Mackenzie also noted that these idiosyncrasies only seemed to affect middle to upper class English and Americans. Unlike Thoreau's rural cabin, these nature resorts of the time were quite grand, offering spa-like therapies and a literal consumption of the landscape or in its waters. The relatively short-lived craze over hydropathy or the water cure offered at places like the Round Hill Water Cure in Northampton, Massachusetts, shown here, is an analog to the practical concerns of clean water supply, urban water supply in cities. Hydropathy focused on the use of mineral-rich waters only found in rural areas. Like the sanitation movement, water cure theory originated in England, although curative bathing practices, of course, date back to Roman times. Actual water cure practice was a multi-stepped affair emphasizing fresh air, exercise, rest, and massage, in addition to using water to wet linens and wrap them around the body for several hours at a time, as well as purging the stomach and bowels. In other words, the cure could not only be attributed to taking the waters, but rather holistic practices of wellness. This was thought to cure skin afflictions and sores, digestive issues, joint pains, and the dreaded nervous diseases of the upper and middle class. And while the etiology of hay fever had not been pinpointed, anecdotally, the symptoms did seem more attenuated in urban areas and during hot weather. An advertisement for the Round Hill Water Cure establishment seen here, written by its proprietor, suggested that its presumably urban readers should escape the heated air and streets of our city and seek for renewal, health, and vigor in the country. The search for healthful air and water was also further flung. The westward expanse of the American landscape was dotted with many towns with natural hot and mineral springs that could provide this escape from the city. Far-flung locales such as Saratoga Springs, Palm Springs, and Calistoga, which are all in California, and Hot Springs, Arkansas, marketed the curative nature of their waters and swathed them in resort architecture largely in the Spanish colonial revival style, evoking its dry, clean air. The growth of resort towns during this period was also no doubt buffered by railroad expansion. The growing ease with which people with the attendant resources and time could escape the city only helped solidify this binary of healthy country and sickly cities. Health, and specifically the search for fresh air, was in fact a large driver of the move to Western cities like Phoenix and Denver as well, which grew significantly by specifically recruiting asthmatics. Dr. Charles Dennison's Rocky Mountain Health Resorts, written in 1880, advertised Colorado as the Switzerland of the Americas, evoking images of clean mountain air and the generally accepted superior moral values of Europeans. This map by Dennison attempts to show the climatic patterns of Colorado, specifically its dry, cool air. And in the book, he details the conditions of each settlement in the states, saying of Colorado Springs, for example, it is the home also of a cultivated class of people who have been attracted to the state by its health conditions. It was estimated that up to a quarter of people that settled in Colorado, Arizona, and California in the late 1800s and very early 1900s did so for their health or a family member's health, and this was made easier by railroad expansion. At the top here, we see a railroad map of Kansas and Colorado, noting stops at health and pleasure resorts. On the bottom, we see Denver at the end of the 19th century. By 1890, Denver had grown by almost a third, with almost 30,000 people moving there to treat consumption. This rate of growth would persist for the next 3 decades. Interestingly, just a couple decades later, during the flu and tuberculosis epidemics of the early 20th century, fresh air and exposure to sunlight would prove preventative and in some cases, literally curative. Following the lead of European sanatoria, American clinics would build rooms to maximize cross-ventilation and porches deep enough to accommodate beds. In Boston, what is now known as Tufts Children's Hospital built the Floating Hospital for Children, holding classes on ships off Boston Harbor with the thought that salt air was better for the treatment of respiratory illnesses in children, an idea that was also found in Hippocrates' writings. The need for fresh air during these epidemics can even be seen in schools built during this time. Here we can see school children on cots wrapped in blankets, while windows open on both sides and high ceilings ensure the movement of fresh, if very cold air. And in fact, the writing on the chalkboard says fresh air classroom as well. Um, and here, just south of where I am in Providence, Rhode Island, is one of the famous open air schools to treat specifically tuberculosis patients, where children would be wrapped in sleeping bags with heated soapstones at their feet. And we can also see this desire for fresh air and domestic architecture from the time. This picture of the Golay House has sleeping porches facing the ocean. And given its location and what we know about therapeutic thinking of the time, we can likely assume that McKim, Mead, and White adapted ideas about health into their design as well. In the latter half of this talk, though, I want to discuss the role of large public landscapes and their relationship to urban health and its relevance to COVID-19. Now, after the cholera and yellow fever epidemics, one question that remained was what to do with the bodies of its victims. Many were opposed to burying them within the borders of the cities, thinking the disease could linger in corpses and make the living ill as well. Dr. Jacob Bigelow, a Boston physician, advocated for cemeteries to be placed outside city limits, and Mount Auburn, the first such rural cemetery, was built in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1831. Mount Auburn was expansive and picturesque, with winding paths free of the urban grid plan to fit the existing topography. The Massachusetts Horticultural Society also established an experimental garden alongside the cemetery. The cemeteries would prove to be wildly popular, with stagecoaches often lined up outside them on weekends, waiting to enter for a leisurely drive. Others saw the recreational use and pastoral environment of cemeteries as a correction to the negative influence of cities in the modern age. Wilson Flagg, in a book called The Moral Influence of Graves, wrote, "We come here to think more earnestly of the higher purposes of life, of its transient duration. We need not to be the disciples of a theological faith to feel the truth of these remarks or to understand the benefit we derive from scenes that tend to conquer an excess of frivolity or to moderate an entire devotion to mammon, which, like intemperance and vice, has ruined many a noble heart." Writer and landscape designer Andrew Jackson Downing, who had held the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn to great acclaim upon its opening, thought people were too joyous, though, and not engaging in enough contemplation during their visits. He also objected to the aesthetic mismatch between the hideous ironmongery, as he called it, of the cemetery and people recreating there. But he was one of the first to point out to cemeteries' popularity as an indication that people would use parks if they were built at the same scale and offered the same pastoral feel and escape from the city. Both Flagg and Downing felt that parks should be a truly public and corpse-free amenity available to all. And they both noted that cemeteries were essentially private enterprises and that they were funded by the purchase of lots. At the same time, urban planners, doctors, and leaders in public health saw urban green spaces as a way to combat disease in the air and water. John Roush, physician and president of the American Public Health Association, wrote the book Public Parks: Their Effects Upon the Moral, Physical, and Sanitary Condition of the Inhabitants of Large Cities in 1869, wherein he advocated for the cleansing power of trees and grass. Even without the assistance of hard empirical evidence, he wrote about how many trees formed protective belts against malaria and to be cautious of winds that would blow the seeds of disease over neighborhoods. And Roush even speculated on the relationship between parks and mental health, saying, "We live in an atmosphere of excitement, more so perhaps than any other community in the world, and it is therefore necessary that all prudent safeguards should be thrown around us to prevent the impairment of the vigor of the mind and the inroads of disease. While it is true that the judicious use of an organ increases its power and confirms its health, excessive exercise, which requires an undue share of vital energy, leads to an unhealthy condition." While Roush was trained in medicine but had an acute interest in urban landscapes, Frederick Law Olmsted was trained as a landscape architect but briefly practiced in public health. During the Civil War, he served as the General Secretary of the United States Sanitary Commission. One of his primary responsibilities during the Civil War was site reconnaissance and planning for soldier camps. With the explicit purpose of keeping soldiers healthy, he would design sites to keep them away from stagnant water and bad airs. Olmsted is, of course, best known today as the designer of Central Park, a canonical work of landscape architecture that reveals many of these progressive era ideas about health and landscape. Olmsted is rightly credited as seamlessly coalescing health, social justice, and ecology in his works. Known as the father of landscape architecture, he frequently moved back and forth between practice, public service, and publication. Olmsted was more visibly political in his early years and published a great deal of writing alongside his built work. While Olmsted and Vaux's Greensward Plan for Central Park was selected in 1858, his actual work on the Sanitary Commission began in 1861 after he departed the project largely due to irreconcilable differences with the Parks Board of Commissioners. He returned to full-time practice in 1865, but also served as the chairman of the American Public Health Association's 1872 committee that was assembled explicitly to look at the sanitary value and uses of shade trees, parks, and forests. There is no doubt that Olmsted's work as a public servant influenced the social bent of his work. Olmsted deeply understood the importance of cross-disciplinary work in both physical and scientific fields, and was even one of the founders of the American Social Science Association. Olmsted's innate anthropological and scientific eyes served him well across the many disciplines in which he served. His initial survey described the Central Park site as squalid, swampy, and littered with squatter shacks and large rocks, an observation we'll return to in a bit. But Olmsted's experience with the sanitary department convinced him that the generalized slum conditions seen in working class neighborhoods were the root causes of disease, but were also amplified through density, resulting in mass contagion. The obsession with alleviating density through green space was one of the most consistent threads through his writing. In reference to planning and reinforcing military camps, he characterized walled medieval cities as places of disease, and he called for the abandonment of the old-fashioned compact way of building towns and the gradual adoption of a custom of laying them out with much larger spaces open to sunlight and fresh air, which he said would yield greater immunity from the plague and other forms of pestilence. Central Park and many of his other parks leveraged fear about the detrimental health effects of diseases to advocate for the health benefits of green space, from providing a mental health respite from the business of the city to the supposed filtering effects of trees on bad airs. Olmsted, of course, far predicted what we now would probably call ecosystem services of the landscape and large parks. In his argument for large public parks within cities, he would say, air is disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air by screening it. Opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and vitiated air of the commercial quarter, and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees, and recently acted upon by sunlight, together with opportunity and inducement to escape from conditions requiring vigilance, wariness, and activity toward other men. The story of Central Park is somewhat complicated, though, by what we know now about the acquisition of the land that it was built on, which, of course, Olmsted was not a part of. Olmsted was, in fact, a well-known abolitionist, and in the 1850s, he traveled through the South to write a series of articles for the New York Times that vividly described the environmental and social conditions of what he called the Cotton Kingdom as an argument against slavery. This nuanced discussion of race is largely invisible in his own writing about the conditions of his projects in the North, though, and even several contemporary accounts of his career. We now know that Central Park was built on the grounds of Seneca Village, a thriving and prosperous African-American neighborhood that fought the removal of their homes and their church and court. The popular press instead portrayed the neighborhood as a ramshackle slum, something that Olmsted supported in his writings as well. In an 1856 edition of the New York Daily Times noted that the park will be built upon a settlement of Ebon inhabitants and Celtic occupants, noting that the former at least presented a pleasing contrast to the latter in common with hogs and goats. The article dismissed their resistance by noting that they were of simple minds and that their inevitable removal will be effected with as much gentleness as possible. Noting the draining of the marshlands to build the park, the article concluded that if other inmates of the shanties do not die of the yellow fever this summer, it will only be because Death himself hesitates to enter such dirty hovels. This was propaganda. Seneca Village had homeowners, Black-owned businesses, and community spaces, but the administrators of Central Park, in effect, also leveraged fear of disease, and in fact minorities, to raise the neighborhood in order to build a park more in line with the European pastoral idea. However, Olmsted's concepts of public landscape as a machine would become even more literal in his design for Boston's Back Bay Fens. Boston's population grew by more than 100,000 between 1800 and 1855, necessitating a massive land-making movement by filling in the bay and an opportunity to build a vision from the ground up. The area of the city we now know as Back Bay was where salt hay would be harvested for livestock that still lived in the city. As the city grew, the Back Bay Fen, seen here, became what was described by the Boston Globe and several other accounts as a public health menace filled with sewage and other waste, as well as effluent from the Stony Brook and Muddy River Creek. And the Back Bay was filled in a movement that not only covered up the water body, but provided ample new land for building houses closer to the city center. And you can see the dredging process here. And so city commissioners were faced with a complex engineering problem. And because the reputation of the Back Bay was so negative, they had to make sure the new neighborhood conveyed a sense of good health and social aspiration. Wide avenues and trees were planned along with educational institutions and an edict that the neighborhood was never to become too overcrowded. And initial plans for the Back Bay preserved 43% of the land for streets and parks, most notably Commonwealth Avenue, a wide boulevard with a generous swath of occupiable green space down the center, which was also designed in the fashion of Haussmann's Parisian boulevards. Olmsted was commissioned in 1877 to further improve the neighborhood with a park, but he also ensured the landscape itself would help protect against further flooding and sewage backup by installing a tidal gate and planning a pump station designed by famed architect H.H. Richardson. I think what we can see in this drawing is also the biological nature of Olmsted's work. While Olmsted did not coin the metaphor that parks are the lungs of the city, although it's often attributed to him, this design really does look like an organ. And Olmsted used one of the water bodies as an open sewage interceptor on the city side in case of heavy rain and overflow, planting trees that could withstand flooding and brackish waters in these events. And the rest of the path had separated paths for strolling and driving. Ecologically, this was a much more complex site than Central Park, and Olmsted's goals here were to take advantage of tidal fluctuations to flush out sewage from the surrounding neighborhoods. Olmsted's design for the fens was decidedly less picturesque and grand than Central Park's design of 20 years earlier, which raised some objections from nearby residents. An anonymous 1884 editorial in the Boston Globe called the park a gigantic cesspool, saying that allowing for the passive retention of overflow, it would only have the effect of making the surface of the pond anything but pleasant to the eye, as there will be nothing picturesque in a green scum of filth, which will constantly accumulate. In the years to come, in all probability, it will be the source of deadly miasma. Of course, again, Olmsted was foreseeing the need to mitigate flooding in the area. And actually, with our more frequent storms and more frequent flooding in Boston today, his design still very much works to that effect. But ecological function was not always compatible with more widespread perceptions of beauty and health. And the common thread through Olmsted's plan is that they were thoroughly biological in nature, blending function with grander ideas about the intertwined systems of the nature and body. Lakes and masses of trees can be read as organs, with gradients of openness and enclosure in its circulatory roots, carrying the benefits of nature to each corner. The carefully modulated paths for pedestrians and carriages echo the nervous systems of the body. A walk in Olmsted's parks was akin to exploring one's circulatory system, placing a patron in closer touch with their internal systems and external nature simultaneously. Olmsted also embraced what we now call the town site consciousness, even if at first he saw his parks as standalone organisms, a respite from the city where people would passively reap the benefits of nature and participate in genteel activities. And there were moments in the Back Bay Fens and throughout the Emerald Necklace that achieved the aesthetics of purified air that were so sought after at this time. Olmsted was vociferously against active recreation, and in fact, subsequent additions to the park not designed by him would acquiesce to the public pressure to put more of these facilities in the park. A 1910 renovation of the Back Bay Fens by Arthur Shercliffe included ball fields and a more formal rose garden. Alongside their mechanical and ecological functions, though, it's worth noting that Olmsted foresaw the democratic and mental health potentials of public open space. Olmsted's parks were driven by the belief that city dwellers of all classes should have access to green space, even if they couldn't leave the city for nature resorts like the elite class. He wrote that parks must be a place to which people may go after their day's work is done, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, and feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets, where they shall, in effect, find the city put far away from them. He goes on to add that the park should have the greatest possible contrast with the streets, the greatest possible contrast with the restraining and confining conditions of the town, those conditions which compel us to walk circumspectly, watchfully, jealously, which compel us to look closely upon others without sympathy. We want depth of wood about it, not only for comfort in hot weather, again, for seeing an ecosystem service that we need today, but also to completely shut out the city from our landscapes. So you may have surmised by now that Olmsted's ideas have an incredible amount of relevance to our present day urban condition, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Back Bay fens and the rest of the parks in the Emerald Necklace that he designed proved so popular that these signs had to be put up and had to be actively monitored. This perhaps speaks to the lack of green space in Boston, but also the timeless nature of its design, its accessibility, and its promise of escape from the city and its ills for fresh, healthful air. And we see other lessons from the past recurring as well. After the respiratory epidemics of the early century, we have essentially closed off many of our buildings for air conditioning and environmental control, only to find ourselves once again thinking about how we can ensure fresh air ventilation, most notably in classrooms. This is an illustration that was actually commissioned for an article that I wrote for LA Plus Journal, and I think it's an incredible metaphor for how we are rethinking the relationship of the urban landscape to our bodies. I joke sometimes that the past year and a half feels like a century compressed in one, and that's especially true when it comes to medical history. In my book, I hypothesize that our built environment has been shaped by how we think illnesses were incubated and spread in each era of history. That is, at first miasma, then germs, and then behavior and lifestyles. And all the fears of past epidemics have been made urgent again with COVID-19. Of course, we know now that the virus is airborne, but you all may remember in the beginning of the pandemic where we were still sanitizing our surfaces. And of course, we've all changed our behavior from more extreme forms of social distancing and quarantine to still thinking about how COVID-19 spread affects our retail behaviors and social behaviors today. At the same time, many of the ways past epidemics were addressed in the urban environment have still proven to be consistent to today's pandemic. We know now that green space is still essential. Sanitation, basic sanitation, and basic provisions of clean air and water are key, and the design of where we live has a large effect on our health outcomes. The built environment does not cause or cure disease, but it is a key factor in either providing opportunities for health or creating the risk of debilitating illness. And it also reflects the social anxieties and also the hopes of our time. And so to close, I offer one last parallel. I began this talk referring to my own experience after Hurricane Katrina. I realized at the time that the urban landscape was where three of the primary crises of our time, climate change, racial justice, and health, intersected. But the landscape also had the power to address them. And I think that's true of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. The pandemic has shattered tenuous systems. It has let the light in. It harshly reveals neglected places and populations, as well as institutions. When we talk about the importance of Olmsted's work and others during this time, I want to make clear that it is not an exhortation to build things the way they used to be, but rather to understand the pressing issues of our time in an ever more complicated context. As an example, here's Franklin Park, the crown jewel of the Emerald Necklace. Olmsted designed beautiful open landscapes and left a great deal of writing about their benefit, but he was also very prescriptive of how they should be used. And in Franklin Park specifically, he decreed there should be no men's athletic teams, no activists, and no speech makers allowed in the park. Cut to last summer, where Franklin Park was the site of one of the largest Black Lives Matter protests in Boston. At his heart, Olmsted was radical. He understood that cities and landscapes change. And at the root of it all, he understood that the value of public parks was that they should be accessible to the working class and the elite, and that parks are a public health infrastructure in everybody's best interests. When the dominant framework of disease causation shifted from miasma theory to germ theory, there was also a shift in how we think about health as a collective endeavor to the individual, and we have left our most vulnerable to languish. I Can't Breathe speaks directly to the oppression and violence inflicted on Black Americans, but it also speaks to the inequality of the built environment in many communities of color that are still fighting for these basic provisions of clean air and water, and who were hardest hit by COVID-19. How we design our cities to provide breathing spaces for all our citizens is as urgent an issue today as it was over 100 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sarah. That was a great talk. Really, really fascinating work, and really, as I mentioned before, kind of timely in terms of its obvious responses relative to COVID-19 and other issues of 2020 in terms of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. I think one of the things that strikes me looking at that, by the way, just for everybody else, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we can get to those. But I do have a question for you in particular. One of the things that strikes me when thinking about the work of Olmsted and let's say his parallels with thinking about parks or landscape as machines, and in some ways as an architect, I think about the work of Corbusier and his work in terms of thinking of cities as machines,
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of let's call it segregation of program in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about scale as it relates to Olmsted's work, where the landscape is always seen as a kind of territorial landscape rather than let's say something that is scaled to smaller populations. Is that something that you see as a kind of antidote or a kind of reversal of that scenario, where let's say Central Park is territorial and covers a huge swath and is available to all of the city, but not everybody lives near it, and they have to travel to it, as opposed to other ways of thinking about when I think about the work that Corb has done in terms of thinking about the master planning of the city and the segregation of program, we come to issues of walkability and kind of monocultural blocks or swaths of territory within the city that are entirely industrial, entirely commercial, entirely residential. And in this case, the way Olmsted approaches it aligns with the way Corb approached it in terms of you get one huge park and that's where you go for greenery, and then you don't have it elsewhere. Is that something that you see as a way of moving forward, or is that, I guess, what are your opinions on that?
Sure. So actually, it's really interesting. In the book, I actually write a chapter on Corbu as well, and sort of his views of health, and ultimately also how they were translated into mid-century public housing prototypes. But to start with the idea of Olmsted, yes, I think, in terms of how a lot of designers and planners, specifically urban planners, thought about health for a long time was actually sort of like separating out the bad influences as far as possible, right? And of course, modern zoning practices come from, in fact, this desire to protect public health, right, and move industrial places away from where people live, and to concentrate, those residential areas far away. And so, I think, that kind of it really actually is sort of the foundations of all of our professions, of architects, of landscape architects and planners, this desire, I think, to scientize the profession as well, to try and take this sort of this very medical approach to thinking about the city and for landscapes. And I think, in terms of because we shape space, right? And the best way people thought about how to tackle health at that time is just to separate out the bad influences, right? That's at its heart, that's what it is. Not only was Olmsted territorial in saying that, this large swath of the city needs to be kept pristine, and it needs to be preserved, but actually within those parks, he had separated paths for horse carriages and separated paths for strolling because he wanted to avoid pedestrian accidents. And so in that way, I think they are akin to each other, and it also speaks to this. It also speaks to this sort of larger way that that the professions have tried to tackle health. Now, Corbu is really interesting, and the reason I discuss him in the book is because he was very much concerned with health too, but his writings came after germ theory, right? And we can actually see like some of his housing units as sort of, he called them individual cells, right? And we can think of that as cells of the body. We can think of it in thinking of disease as something that's tackled at the individual level, right? And Corbu thinks it's just sort of repeated over and over again, right, to make a community. It's fascinating because in his writings, he talks about sunlight and he talks about fresh air as sort of vaccinations in of itself. He had very exact measurements for what temperature apartment should be, how many liters of air need to be going through units at so many times, and how far people should walk. Um, and so while there's a direct line between his work and Olmsted's, Corbu was very much influenced by this turn, as I call it, these landscapes pre-germ theory were more about collective health, but it also forces us to make sort of more broad-based assumptions about what is good for people, and it relates to sort of this moral paternalism as well. Whereas in modernism, we see these, trying to solve for the problem of health as very much of the individual, and that follows our thinking of health and medicine as something that's treated as the microbial level. Where does that get us now? I'm not sure, right? So in the mid-century, there were even further schisms. Everybody talks about that, but there was a large schism sort of, between public health and planning and design that we're trying to reconnect now, especially in the wake of crises such as climate change. So how do we think about landscape infrastructure, especially landscape infrastructure for health, that is something that is more distributed, that is not taking over large plots of land, but something that where can we find sort of these interstitial spaces to address health collectively, but at a much smaller scale than before.
I guess in that, on that same note, I mean, we can think about like a lot of these changes that happened because of, as you mentioned, cholera and typhus and typhoid and these other pandemics, and how they've affected the appearance of the built environment. I used to live in London, in East London. I lived right next door to Victoria Park, which was one of the first parks that was brought to East London because of the concerns about cholera. I think we've also seen that modernism itself is at least a tangential byproduct of the Spanish flu. What do you see as ways that we can be responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of the built environment?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So actually, I just wrote an article with Michael Murphy of Mass Design, who has built incredible healthcare facilities for cholera and tuberculosis, which is still very much an issue, right, in developing countries, but relying on this idea of fresh air ventilation. And we wrote this article as sort of an argument to bring back some of those ideas that have been lost sort of in the wake of trying to control of thermal comfort instead in schools. I mean, this is easy to talk about this. We did a study of public schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And, proposing outdoor classrooms. It's a little bit harder in Massachusetts than it would be, say, in California or say in Hawaii, where I was before, to get people used to the idea of, especially children, of sending their children to outdoor classrooms. But, but the truth is sort of thinking about, and again, this is maybe my bias as somebody that's trained in both architecture and landscape architecture, but we need to kind of think about the porousness of the building skin, not only for the function of fresh air ventilation and for pandemic resilience, but because it can have so many other benefits as well, such as like the viewing of the landscape on mental health and then schools attention, um, and outdoor exposure as well. And so I think, much as public health and medicine and architecture have been siloed for a long time, maybe perhaps one of the ways we start to reconnect the built environment for health is thinking about buildings, landscapes in the urban areas. And it sort of starts with breaking down building skins maybe, and thinking about bringing fresh air ventilation back into a lot of our institutional buildings.
Great. There's a couple questions here in the chat here. Is there a current equivalent of the hot springs resorts such as Colorado Springs or Glenwood Springs? Are resorts such as Mammoth Mountain an example? And if so, is there a similar healthy equivalent for the underserved? This is an intentionally open-ended question. This comes from one
Yeah.
of our faculty, Mark Schiller.
Oh, okay. Hi, Mark. Um, so I think you hit the nail on the head in the latter part of the question is, how, I talked about sort of the parallels to COVID in the early part of the work. I think we all remember seeing those stories in the New York Times of people escaping the cities, right, to go to the Hamptons or to go to rural areas. And we're still seeing the effects of maybe people leaving to San Francisco and moving to Montana to access sort of, fresh air and more space, but that this was an option that was only open to the elite. And so, we may be seeing it on a much larger scale and a much permanent scale. But of course, what happens with that is the people, frontline workers, underserved populations that had to stay in the city also bore the brunt of the COVID 19 pandemic. And I think this idea of, how do you bring sort of curative landscapes to the underserved is actually a really vital question, and one I'm trying to grapple with now in my own research, and thinking about sort of the opportunity for interstitial landscapes. It's probably not on the scale, I don't know if we'll see anything on the scale of large urban parks anymore, and certainly not sort of resorts, right? And that's been a thread throughout time too. I was reading some accounts, from the late 1800s when they were starting to build these sort of like early streetcar suburbs. And I can't remember who it was, but there was a planner who was bemoaning that, oh well, the factory workers, they don't want to move away. They want to be close to the factory where they live. And of course, it's not just a personal preference, but it's sort of, the constrainment of housing markets and where people can go. And of course, this changes depending on where you are. Um, of course, there are many situations, there are more and more cities in the United States now where actually underserved populations live farther and farther outside the city and have to undertake longer commutes to get into the city. That said, even though they live far out of the city, their environments are not necessarily healthy because it may be dominated by auto infrastructure, etc. So I think, Mark, to go back to the beginning of your question, I think the sort of like resort type places that sprang up in the late 1800s and early 1900s, um, I don't know if they're as present now, although some of these places in New England, such as the White Mountains of New Hampshire, that's still seen as sort of like a healthful getaway. But in terms of targeting underserved populations, I think it's about thinking about remaking the cities where we are, where people live, and how do we make them healthier without displacement or gentrification. And I think that's sort of the stickiest question we have to deal with regarding health in the urban landscape today.
Yeah, that was a point I think that was made quite clear with your reference to Seneca Village and the history of Central Park. And I think there's a lot of that type of history we see in Los Angeles as well, in terms of the kind of displacement of the Mexican American community in Chavez Ravine for Dodger Stadium, displacement of the African American community at Bruce's Beach and Manhattan Beach. It goes on and on and on. Another question here is, is there still recognition and interest in filtering effect of trees and flora, as well as the antibacterial effects of UV, ultraviolet light?
Um, so interesting. Like I can't speak to sort of like maybe at that very specific level, although my colleague at Northeastern is Kate Kennan, who wrote a really great book on phytoremediation and sort of remediating toxic landscapes. And I was sitting in on her class today, and she had a colleague in, and I wish I could remember her last name, but Stevie, Fulmari, I think is the name. So it's so interesting. I was just watching this presentation this morning, who's coming out with a book that's specifically talking about that, but sort of the virus filtering potential of plants, especially in indoor environments. Um, that is not that's not my particular research. But I think it's fascinating, and obviously, this is something that she's been working on for a long time too, and all of a sudden has become relevant. That said, I think I kind of deal with landscapes on a broader level, and I think what is important there is sort of, again, these even though they weren't called ecosystem services at the time, but what OMSA kind of, and John Rausch and many other landscape architects sort of foresaw as ecosystem services, not just in the potential for trees to filter air, but they also, talked about providing shade in hot areas. And now, of course, urban heat islands are a large discussion, I'm sure very much in Los Angeles, right? And sort of the inequity of trees and inequity in mitigating extreme heat, which landscapes can serve as well. And then in Boston, sort of the main issue is kind of the uptake of stormwater and preventing the flooding of neighborhoods. So that to say, I'm not a plant scientist, unfortunately, but there are many great people that are, and I keep wondering sort of what research we're going to see coming out of COVID for people that kind of deal in indoor environments and plants. So I would bet we see more interest in it.
Yeah, it's really kind of fascinating kind of way to index inequities in this built environment through kind of greenery. Like it's definitely something that one of our faculty members, Kyle Konis, has been looking at in terms of, looking at shade as a kind of reflection of inequity, or lack of shade, I should say, particularly here in Los Angeles. But I think also in places like Dubai or the Middle East, where it's actually not the shade per se, but it's actually the infrastructural resource that is an indicator of wealth. In terms of, if you have a lush garden, it's a indicator of wealth because it's a desert, and so it means that you're pumping in all of this irrigation. Are there any last questions here for Sarah? There's no more questions. Oh, look who's here.
Hi, Dean Curry.
Hi.
Hey, Milton.
Sorry.
Good.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Alvin. And thanks, Sarah. That was very inspiring. I think I was, reminded in your talk of maybe different points in our history where justice and inequity were intuitively, you kind of knew what that meant, along with human rights. And I think now we so often have to put qualifiers on the front end or back end of justice or inequity. And I think your lecture and the spirit of your work is very important in terms of, in a way, rejoining all these qualifiers back into kind of an intuitive sense of what we think, just from being human, makes sense to us, makes common sense to us, kind of the way that we approach space, the way that we approach climate, the way that we approach mutual respect for fellow humans. So I really enjoyed your talk in that regard, as we all think about kind of how how these terms can be applied and actually executed in kind of public policy, design, practice, etc. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We did have one last question pop up very briefly, if we can get to that one, because this is coming from Allison Hirsch, the director of our landscape architecture program.
Hey, Allison.
Thank you, Sarah, for this amazing presentation on your work. I hope my landscape history students are all here. We talked about the plague outbreak in LA in 1924 today, and how that legitimized the city's forced removal of the Mexican population there to rezone the area for industrial development. As a practicing landscape architect, mental health seems to be becoming a health crisis as acute as a contagion of viral or bacterial conditions. Are you dealing with this at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news and bad news is, first of all, I would have to defer. Like, I'm not the expert in mental health specifically, but there's so many great landscape architects slash environmental psychologists that are looking into this, and I think, you know, again, like the importance of public spaces and public landscapes was really kind of foretold, you know, by both physicians and practitioners such as Olmsted, in thinking of a way to and thinking of a way for kind of nature to provide an escape from the city. You know, that said, there is work by landscape architects such as Jenny Rowe at University of Virginia, Bill Sullivan at University of Illinois, who are actually putting, you know, MRI helmets on people and walking them through the cities and walking them through landscapes and kind of understanding the effect on stress. And something I did learn actually in my experience in architecture and in healthcare architecture is how stress is kind of an underlying cause or an underlying exacerbating factor in so many other kind of modern day diseases that we deal with today. And so landscapes are incredibly important. I mean, the good news is, you know, if you have a landscape that's sort of aimed towards mitigating climate change or sort of ecosystem services, which actually is more of my research, if it's designed beautifully and if it's designed correctly and it has access, hopefully it can address mental health inequities as well. And I would just close on that respect. One, I actually just did a BBC podcast called Landscapes of the Mind, where again, I mean, being asked about Olmsted, it's kind of weird becoming a de facto Olmsted scholar when there are much better Olmsted scholars out there. But I think because I write specifically about his connection to health, they asked me to join in. Jenny Rowe is featured on that, as well as James Corner, you know, talking about their work and the relationship of urban landscapes to mental health. And I would also, for any students listening that are interested in this, I would actually point to the work of Gina South, who is a physician and works at University of Pennsylvania, and did an amazing study that I talk about in the book, actually, where they were looking at an underserved neighborhood in Philadelphia and took 400 vacant lots, and some of them they greened, some of them they just you know, performed maintenance on, and some of them the vacant lots were kind of left as they were. And the positive effects of mental health just by sort of turning some of these vacant lots into small green spaces that people in the neighborhood could access, the you know, the effects on lowered depression and better mental health were really amazing. So and she's doing incredible work actually acting on that in Philadelphia. So I discuss it a little bit in the end of the book, but you know, she's putting great papers out there, and she's a wonderful speaker as well. So Gina South and her work in Philadelphia, and a physician, not a landscape architect, but direct connections to that.
That's great. Great resources for our students. So thank you. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And when we're back in person completely, we'll have to have you onto campus and interacting with our students and faculty. It'd be great.
Would love to.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Sarah.
Have a great night. Thank you, Alvin. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.